Welcome back to my YouTube channel today, and here is the content of today's video. In the modern world, the battlefield is no longer defined solely by trenches, borders, or the movement of armies across the earth. Increasingly, geopolitical confrontation unfolds in the sky within invisible boundaries drawn not on maps, but on radar screens. The Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, is one such boundary. It is not sovereign territory, yet it functions as the first ring of a nation's strategic awareness. To enter it without warning is to test resolve, to probe reaction times, and to send a message far louder than any diplomatic communique. South Korea's ADIZ sits at one of the most delicate intersections of global power. It is the crossroads where three nuclear-armed states, China, Russia, and North Korea, interact with two of the United States' most important allies, South Korea and Japan. It covers air corridors critical to the world's busiest shipping lanes and sits adjacent to the defense networks that bind Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul into a tight trilateral security structure. This is not just another patch of airspace. It is a strategic hinge on which the architecture of Northeast Asian security rests. When 9 military aircraft from China and Russia jointly entered this airspace, it was not a matter of coincidence or navigational error. It was a deliberate signal crafted through choreography and timing. Aircraft do not wander into ADIZ zones by accident. They follow predefined routes shaped by political intention. The entry into Korea's ADIZ was therefore less an intrusion and more a statement, a demonstration that Beijing and Moscow are willing to contest the boundaries of a U.S.-aligned security order in the Pacific. To understand why this matters, one must appreciate the deeper meaning of an ADIZ. It is not a trial balloon of aggression, but a theater of psychological influence. The act of flying military aircraft into another nation's ADIZ tests not the nation's sovereignty, but its response calculus. Will it scramble jets? Will it file diplomatic protests? Will it show restraint or escalate tensions? The zone becomes a mirror reflecting a state's confidence, cohesion, and strategic judgment. For South Korea, this intrusion strikes at a particularly vulnerable moment. Seoul is navigating a narrow path between its alliance with the United States and its economic dependence on China. The ADIZ challenge forces South Korea to respond militarily by deploying fighter jets while simultaneously calculating the economic and diplomatic consequences of overreaction. It is the kind of dilemma that characterizes the geopolitics of a multipolar world, where nations no longer operate within simple spheres of influence, but must constantly balance competing pressures. China and Russia understand this balancing act well. Their coordinated presence in the ADIZ was crafted not to provoke war, but to shape perceptions, to remind Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington that the skies over Northeast Asia are contested, and that the age of uncontested American air dominance is fading. In this sense, the incident is not merely a breach of airspace. It is an early sign of a region in transition, a region where power is redistributed not through treaties or declarations, but through the trajectories of aircraft slicing through sensitive skies. The joint intrusion by Russian and Chinese aircraft into South Korea's ADIZ cannot be dismissed as a navigational oversight or an isolated act of military restlessness. Such explanations underestimate the deliberate choreography behind contemporary great power signaling. Air forces today navigate with exquisite precision When they cross into sensitive zones, it is because political leaders have chosen for them to do so. Geography may shape the routes, but strategy determines the intention. To decipher the motive, we must begin with the simple fact that Russia and China are not merely neighbors, they have become strategic partners, bound not by ideology, but by a shared conviction that the American-led security order in Asia should not remain unchallenged. Their aircraft did not wander into the zone separately, they entered it together in formation as part of a coordinated mission. That alone tells us this was not an accident, but a message. For China, the Korean ADIZ overlaps with its own self-declared ADIZ announced in 2013, a move that itself sparked tensions with Japan and South Korea. By flying through this contested airspace, Beijing reaffirms its refusal to accept the U.S. aligned security architecture drawn by Washington and its allies in the post-war era. China seeks to normalize a world in which its aircraft roam freely across zones, once policed exclusively by American air power, asserting that the Western-defined boundaries of East Asia are not immutable. For Russia, the motives run deeper than geography. Despite its preoccupation with the war in Ukraine, Moscow is eager to demonstrate that it still commands strategic breadth from the Baltic to the Pacific. The intrusion serves as a reminder that Russia remains a Pacific power with long-range capabilities capable of unsettling the security balance in Northeast Asia. In the shadow of Western sanctions, these flights are a low-cost, high-impact method of asserting relevance on the global stage. But beyond the tactical motivations lies something more subtle, the convergence of narratives. Both China and Russia perceive growing trilateral cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea as a threat to their regional influence. Washington's renewed focus on Indo-Pacific alliances, whether through the U.S., Japan, ROK trilateral framework, increased joint exercises, or the expansion of missile defense integration, has prompted Beijing and Moscow to respond in kind. Their intrusion is therefore not merely about airspace, it is about counterbalancing an emerging alignment that they view as constricting their strategic room to maneuver. In this sense, the ADIZ penetration is a form of aerial diplomacy, a signature of the new strategic era, diplomacy conducted not through speeches or communiques, but through coordinated military presence in contested domains. The skies become a canvas on which states paint their geopolitical claims. It is also a test, one aimed at Seoul's composure, Washington's resolve, and Tokyo's vigilance. Russia and China want to know how quickly South Korea will scramble jets, how loudly Washington will protest, and how firmly Japan will react to the intrusion into overlapping ADIZ zones. The incident is a probe into the psychological architecture of the U.S.-led alliance system. Ultimately, the flights were not meant to trigger conflict, but to signal a shift. Russia and China are asserting that East Asia is no longer a hierarchical security environment dominated by a single power, but a contested arena in which rising and resurgent states intend to redraw the margins of influence. To fully understand the meaning of the joint Russian-Chinese intrusion into South Korea's ADIZ, one must look beyond Seoul. The real audience for this performance resides in Washington and Tokyo, the two capitals shaping a new security framework in East Asia that Russia and China see as increasingly hostile to their interests. The aircraft that penetrated the zone were not merely challenging Korean air defenses, they were challenging the emerging strategic architecture that binds the United States, Japan, and South Korea in unprecedented alignment. For Washington, the message is pointed: Russia and China can coordinate militarily in the Pacific, even amid global crises, and Washington must adjust its strategic calculus accordingly. In recent years, the U.S. Has expanded joint exercises with Seoul and Tokyo, deployed missile defense systems across the region, and strengthened intelligence sharing agreements. It has also drawn Japan and South Korea, historically divided by historical grievances, into a closer trilateral structure, something unimaginable a decade ago. This evolving partnership threatens both Moscow and Beijing, who see it as an encirclement of their Pacific frontiers. The incursion into the ADIZ is therefore a reminder that the U.S. does not operate unchallenged, and that any attempt to build an Indo-Pacific deterrence network will be met with countermoves designed to stretch American attention and resources. For Tokyo, the signal is even more direct. Japan's ADIZ overlaps heavily with that of South Korea, and the Russian-Chinese aircraft entered both simultaneously, a deliberate move that forces Japan to respond alongside Seoul. This dual incursion highlights the uncomfortable reality that Japan's geographic position, caught between Russia to the north and China to the west, places it at the center of a shifting balance of power. The message to Japan is twofold. China is prepared to challenge Japan's claims to regional airspace, particularly at a time when Tokyo has taken a more assertive stance on Taiwan and increased defense spending. Russia remains a northern threat capable of projecting influence over the Sea of Japan and beyond, regardless of its commitments in Ukraine. Japan's response, scrambling fighter jets, was predictable, but predictable in a way that China and Russia wanted to observe. In the world of strategic competition, reactions matter as much as provocations. Every scramble, every diplomatic note, every radar lock becomes a data point in a larger map of intentions and thresholds. In this sense, the ADIZ incursion functions as an intelligence gathering tool. Russia and China are testing how quickly U.S. aligned militaries respond, whether Tokyo and Seoul coordinate or act independently, how Washington frames the event diplomatically, whether Japan strengthens its Pacific commitments or hesitates in fear of escalation. What emerges is a picture of regional realignment. Russia and China are drawing ever closer, while Japan, South Korea, and the United States move toward deeper integration. The skies above Northeast Asia, long a symbolic frontier, have become a stage upon which these competing visions now collide. Thus, the incursion is not merely a tactical act, but a strategic communication, an assertion that the Pacific is no longer an uncontested domain of American air power, and that the new century will be shaped by a far more complex symphony of rising and resurgent powers. South Korea has long lived at the intersection of great power ambition, its geography wedged between a nuclear-armed North Korea, an ascendant China, a resurgent Russia, and a distant but dominant United States forces it into perpetual strategic calculation. The intrusion of 9 Russian and Chinese aircraft into its ADIZ is therefore not just a violation of protocol, it is a direct test of Seoul's strategic posture in a region where even a measured response reverberates far beyond national borders. South Korea's first instinct, understandably, was military. Fighter jets F-15Ks and F-35 seconds took to the skies in response. This reaction is standard practice trained through decades of drills, but it is also the safest option in a volatile region. Project strength, avoid escalation, maintain surveillance, yet military interception addresses only the immediate tactical challenge. The deeper question confronting Seoul is what strategic response should follow. South Korea has three paths before it. The first path is deterrence, a show of strength meant to signal that Korean airspace, whether sovereign or ADIZ, cannot be violated without consequence. Seoul could expand air patrols, increase readiness levels, or conduct joint exercises with the United States and Japan. Such actions would reassure domestic audiences and allied partners, but they would also risk provoking further challenges from Russia and China, who view increased U.S.-led military integration as justification for their own countermeasures. The second path is diplomacy, a quieter approach that avoids escalation while seeking clarity. South Korea could lodge formal protests, demand explanations, or request military hotlines to reduce the risk of accidental conflict. Diplomacy, however, carries its own political risks. Critics at home may view it as weakness, while Beijing and Moscow could interpret it as a sign of strategic hesitation. The third path is strategic restraint, a choice that acknowledges a difficult truth. South Korea's security is tied to the United States, but its economic fate is tied to China. Overreaction could jeopardize trade relations that Seoul cannot afford to lose. Here lies the uncomfortable paradox. South Korea cannot alienate China without harming its own economy, yet it cannot distance itself from the United States without weakening its deterrent posture against North Korea. It is precisely this paradox that China and Russia are exploiting. By entering the ADIZ, they are not seeking confrontation, but forcing South Korea to reveal its priorities. Will Seoul move closer to Washington and Tokyo, reinforcing the trilateral alignment that Beijing fears, or will it seek a more balanced stance, attempting to preserve room for maneuver between competing powers? This dilemma is further complicated by North Korea. Every move Seoul makes is scrutinized by Pyongyang, which thrives on moments of strategic ambiguity. A strong military response might provoke North Korean provocations. A soft one might embolden them. In essence, South Korea is navigating a geopolitical tightrope with no easy or risk-free options. The ADIZ intrusion is simply the latest reminder that Seoul must balance deterrence with diplomacy, alliance commitments with economic interdependence, and national pride with regional reality. Jeffrey Sachs might put it this way: South Korea is not merely reacting to aircraft, it is responding to the shape of a shifting world order. The entry of Russian and Chinese aircraft into South Korea's ADIZ is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a far deeper transformation underway across Northeast Asia, a region that is shifting from a stable U.S.-anchored security order to a fluid and unpredictable landscape shaped by multipolar tensions. In this emerging reality, traditional borders and treaties matter less than the subtle, continuous exchanges of strategic signaling that occur almost daily in the air and at sea. The first and most striking feature of this new order is the normalization of military probing. For Russia and China, ADIZ incursions are not exceptional events. They are instruments of statecraft. Each flight tests response times, coordination patterns among allied forces, and the political will of the countries involved. In this sense, Northeast Asia has entered a period where peace is defined not by the absence of military activity, but by the absence of direct confrontation. The skies become a zone of perpetual contestation where aircraft move like chess pieces, rarely touching, yet constantly influencing the board. A second feature is the deepening of strategic blocs. China and Russia, though historically wary of each other, now find common cause in counterbalancing U.S. influence. Their coordinated maneuvers over the Pacific symbolize a shared desire to reshape the regional security architecture. Meanwhile, Japan, South Korea, and the United States are strengthening trilateral cooperation, integrating missile defense systems, and expanding intelligence sharing. The result is a dynamic of competing alignments, not yet alliances, but close enough to provoke mistrust and reactive countermeasures. A third aspect is the erosion of strategic ambiguity. For decades, regional actors could navigate between China's economic influence and America's security umbrella. Today, those spaces are narrowing. Japan has abandoned its post-war military restraint. South Korea is pressured to align more firmly with the United States, and China is prepared to challenge aerial and maritime norms that once seemed untouchable. In such a climate, even minor incidents, an aerial intercept, a radar lock, a misinterpreted maneuver can trigger diplomatic crises. Furthermore, the Korean Peninsula itself remains a fulcrum of instability. North Korea's missile launches, its nuclear ambitions, and its growing proximity to Russia complicate Seoul's strategic environment. The ADIZ intrusion does not occur in a vacuum. It interacts with a broader picture of shifting allegiances and escalating arms development across the region. The most profound implication, however, lies in the return of great power competition to an area that had long managed its tensions through deterrence and diplomacy. Northeast Asia is becoming what Europe once was during the Cold War, a dense web of competing interests where small shifts can carry outsized consequences. The U.S. seeks to maintain primacy, China seeks to expand influence, Russia seeks relevance, Japan seeks security, and South Korea seeks autonomy within constraints. The ADIZ intrusion does not occur in a vacuum. It interacts with a broader picture of shifting allegiances and escalating arms development across the region. The most profound implication, however, lies in the return of great power competition to an area that had long managed its tensions through deterrence and diplomacy. Northeast Asia is becoming what Europe once was during the Cold War, a dense web of competing interests where small shifts can carry outsized consequences. The U.S. seeks to maintain primacy, China seeks to expand influence, Russia seeks relevance, Japan seeks security, and South Korea seeks autonomy within constraints. In this environment, stability becomes fragile not because war is imminent, but because strategic misinterpretation grows more likely. When aircraft from opposing blocs fly within minutes of each other, when radar screens light up daily with incursions and intercepts, and when each maneuver is scrutinized for political meaning, the margin for error narrows. The ADIZ incident then is both a warning and a window, a warning that the region is entering a new era of militarized signaling, and a window into the geopolitical transformations that will define the century ahead.